Hey there, all you disheveled weirdos. Real quick before we get into today's video, if you've ever liked any of my videos, or even if you liked today's video, if you could like, subscribe, and or share, it really does help my channel to grow. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. This is gonna be one of my bi-weekly vlogs I do about mental health, and today we're gonna talk about complex PTSD, DIDs, and MPDs, how they affect your body and what that ultimately does to your brain. So what happens during times of high stress or anxiety is a chemical reaction, and you may physically feel it as being anxious or feeling a little panicky or a little bit nervous. But when you live in these situations for long periods of time, it surpasses a chemical reaction and it starts to shrink the pieces of your brain. Parts of your brain that extreme trauma and PTSD affect the most are the amygdala, hippocampus, prefrontal, and medial cortex. The first part of the brain we're going to talk about is the hippocampus. Most people are familiar with that as monitoring your memories and how you respond to fear. So what happens during long-term stress or PTSD is that part of the brain actually shrinks. What it mostly does is it takes away any amount of time between the event and the present situation. So if I'm triggered and I am remembering this trauma, it physically feels like it is happening to me again. Because that part of my brain is shrunk, it does not function properly. What's actually physically happened to it is that it's experienced atrophy and it's withered away. The next part of the brain we're going to talk about is the amygdala, and that's like the part of your brain that helps you interpret emotion. Like you've seen the fear and now your amygdala is taken over, and now that's responsible for your emotional response to the fear. In cases of long-term stress or abuse, your amygdala actually swells up. I want to jump in for a minute and interrupt myself and make a clarification. When I say these parts of our brain are physically affected, I don't mean during times of trauma and response. I mean that is how our brain physically is now. The hippocampus is now all the time forever shrank, and the amygdala is all the time forever swollen. So those parts of my brain are for all the time forever not working properly. The amygdala is pretty significant because it's a primal part of our brain. Fear is a primal function. You may be familiar with the phrase negative bias, and that doesn't mean somebody who's a Debbie Downer all the time. That just means back in primitive days, we might see a field full of raspberry bushes, but we need to be able to see the one jaguar that's crouching in the tall grass behind it waiting to hunt us. It's not a need to be negative. It was a primitive primal need to stay safe that kind of carried with us through that part of our brain. To a point, the heightened fear response is totally normal for everybody. One of the signs or red flags that your amygdala has started to misfire is if you start to experience symptoms of hypervigilance, like a really heightened fear response, if you're really, really easily startled, or if you jump at anything. It's commonly associated with being your fight or flight portion of your brain. As we discussed earlier, your hippocampus is kind of responsible for seeing the fear and recognizing the fear, and your amygdala is responsible for your emotional response to your fear. Because that portion of the brain is chronically working double time all the time, it's not functioning properly. Last part of the brain that we're going to talk about today admittedly should have been the first part of the brain that we talked about, and that's the frontal cortex, and that is responsible for just a whole lot of information. It's responsible for regulating your sleep, for logic, judgment, decision making, the ability to take in new information. The frontal lobe is another part of your brain that, a lot like the hippocampus, it experiences atrophy. It withers away and shrinks. So a lot like the hippocampus, it's not so much that it's misfiring, it's that it's not there anymore. With the amygdala, it's overactive, but with the hippocampus and the frontal lobes, they like just don't exist. And it's generally at this point where a person will either completely disassociate or they'll completely panic. Basically, my hippocampus, which is responsible for seeing and acknowledging a situation, has withered away and died. My frontal lobe, which is responsible for like logically responding to it, has fucking checked out. And all that's left is my overactive amygdala, which is responsible for my emotional response to anything, which at this point is extremely